There is a moment in every impossible standoff when one side simply stops believing the other can win. Not because anyone surrendered, not because anyone fired a shot, but because someone looked at a problem from an angle nobody else had bothered to consider. And suddenly, the entire equation changed. This is the story of one such moment, and of 60 men who climbed a wall that an entire army had agreed was unclimbable, and in doing so, rewrote how soldiers would be trained for the next 70 years. Major Gustaf Kleinschmidt had a problem he could not name, and that was the strangest part of it. His fortress had not been breached. His men had not been overrun. His ammunition stores were full, and his concrete walls stood exactly as thick and intact as they had the day before. And yet 60 men were sitting on a ledge behind him, and every time he turned to look at them, something cold settled in his chest that 30 years of soldiering had never prepared him for. This is not a story about artillery barrages or tank columns or generals delivering speeches before a final push. This is a story about 60 men from the mountains of Nepal who solved a military puzzle that had already cost hundreds of soldiers their lives. And they solved it not by fighting harder, but by thinking in a direction no one else had thought to look. In the spring of 1944, Monte Cassino was not simply a hill in Italy. It was a wall across the entire peninsula. The Germans had transformed the ancient Benedictine monastery, crowning its summit into a defensive system so layered, so complete, that Allied commanders had quietly begun to suspect it might never fall to conventional assault. The mountain commanded the junction of the only two practical roads to Rome. Whoever held it controlled the campaign. Whoever lost it, lost Italy. The Germans had held it since the previous autumn, and nothing about their posture suggested they intended to give it up. For weeks, the British 10th Corps had been throwing themselves at the lower slopes. Every approach was pre-registered by German machine guns. Every gully had been mapped by their mortar crews long before any British soldier set foot in it. By some estimates, a man crossing open ground on those slopes had less than 40 seconds before German fire found him. Hundreds of British soldiers had died simply learning the shape of the problem, and still the mountain stood. In the specific position that would become the center of this story, sat on a secondary ridge below the main monastery. A cluster of reinforced bunkers under the command of Major Gustaf Kleinschmidt, a Bavarian career officer who had earned every line on his face on the Eastern Front. Kleinschmidt was not a man who panicked easily. He had held a defensive line outside Kharkov through a winter that left half his men with frostbite. He had watched Soviet tanks crest a ridge at dawn and held his nerve long enough for his anti-tank crews to do their work. He understood defensive warfare the way a master craftsman understands wood or stone, through years of repetition, through a bone-deep familiarity with pressure that no manual could teach. His position reflected exactly that competence. The bunkers were carved into the rock face itself, their concrete poured thick enough to shrug off direct artillery hits. His machine gun nests had overlapping fields of fire covering every approach up the slope. He commanded roughly 150 men, held food enough for 2 months, and carried the psychological weight of a commander who had already repelled 3 separate British assaults. The first had come straight up the main path and been cut to pieces before it covered half the distance. The second had used smoke screens for cover and been picked apart anyway by defenders who had memorized every inch of that ground in their sleep. The third had brought combat engineers forward and still gained nothing but more casualties. After each failure, Kleinschmidt's men cleaned their weapons, ate their rations, and waited calmly for whatever came next. What Kleinschmidt did not have, and could not possibly have anticipated, was a British officer willing to ask the one question nobody else had thought to ask. Not where to attack from, but who to ask. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, had been fighting in Italy since the previous year. They were a unit British staff officers respected in the abstract and consistently underestimated in the specific. Respected because their record in North Africa had been extraordinary. Night raids that ended with positions captured without a single shot fired. The kind of silent, close quarters work that German intelligence had taken to documenting with something close to nervousness. Underestimated. Because when it came time to plan a set-piece assault on a fortified ridge, it simply did not occur to most senior British officers to walk over and ask a Gurkha sergeant how he might approach it. Sergeant Lalbahadur Thapa was 30 years old and had been a soldier since he was 18. He came from a village high in the Palpa district of Nepal, so far up into the hills that reaching the nearest town meant a full day's walk down mountain paths that had no names on any British map. He had grown up on those paths. He had carried loads up them since he was a child, moved livestock across them in total darkness, navigated them during monsoon season when the rock itself seemed to turn liquid beneath his feet. To most of the men holding this ridge, the vertical was an obstacle. To Thapa, it was simply the shape of the world he had been born into. When Thapa was finally brought forward to study Kleinmeyer's position, he spent almost no time looking at it the way every other officer had looked at it. He walked the perimeter. He studied angles that British planners had long since dismissed as tactically irrelevant. On the second day, he stopped behind the ridge at its rear face and stood looking at the cliff there for a very long time without saying a word. It was roughly 400 feet of near vertical limestone, smooth in long stretches, barely cracked in others. No British officer had given it serious thought, because no British officer believed it could be climbed. Thapa believed otherwise. His proposal was rejected twice, once at battalion level, once at brigade. The objections were not unreasonable on their face. The cliff was too steep. The men would be carrying full combat loads. A single dislodged stone, a single careless sound, would bring the entire German garrison's fire down on them long before they reached the top. One staff officer reportedly remarked that the plan only made sense to someone who had never actually looked at the cliff. Thapa had looked at the cliff. More than that, he had quietly climbed part of it at night with 2 of his men to confirm something he suspected was there. A wide ledge, roughly 2/3 of the way up, completely invisible from the German positions above, flat enough for 60 men to stand on and wide enough for them to wait in until dawn. He reported what he had found. He asked again. The second refusal held until a British artillery officer named Major James Whitmore, who had watched all 3 failed assaults unfold from a forward observation post and had run out of faith in anything resembling a conventional solution, used a personal connection to take the proposal directly to the divisional commander. His argument was simple. Everything tried so far had failed completely. This had not been tried at all. Give the Gurkhas one night. Permission came through on the 13th of June. Thapa gathered his 60 men that same afternoon. He explained the plan without ceremony. The cliff, the ledge, the weight they would carry, the hour they needed to arrive. He told them what they would bring: rifles, ammunition, 2 water canteens each, and their Gurkhas. He told them they would climb in total darkness and total silence, that they would reach the ledge before 3 in the morning, and that they would be in position the instant the light came. Nobody asked whether it was possible. For these men, that had never been the question that mattered. They reached the base of the cliff at 11:47 that night. Every equipment strap had been wrapped in cloth to silence any metallic sound. Every face had been blackened. Every buckle and clasp had been checked twice. Thapa went first. The climb took 2 hours and 36 minutes. The cliff was every bit as brutal as it had looked from below. Cold limestone offering thin holds and narrower ledges, long angled sections where the only option was friction, patience, and a complete trust in your own hands. At 100 feet, the angle steepened sharply. At 200 feet, fingers began cramping from the combination of cold stone and the weight of full combat loads. Somewhere past 250 feet, a single boot scraped a stone loose. The stone fell into the darkness below. Every man on that cliff face froze completely. The stone landed somewhere in soft ground, far below. No alarm came. 60 men breathed again, and the climb continued. The last man pulled himself onto the ledge at 2:23 in the morning. 60 men, 60 pounds of equipment each. 400 feet of raw rock climbed in total darkness, without ropes, without a single sound reaching German ears, without losing a single man. They lay flat against the ledge and waited for the light. At 4:47, a German soldier on early morning patrol walked to the edge of the cliff to relieve himself. He looked down. He saw 60 men looking back up at him. His mouth opened. Thapa stood. He drew his kukri and raised it above his head, just as the first gray light of dawn caught the blade. The German soldier closed his mouth and ran. Within minutes, Kleinmeyer himself came to the edge and looked down. This was a man who had seen most of what war could produce in 5 years of fighting. He had never seen this. 60 soldiers, behind his walls, behind his concrete, behind every defensive measure he had spent months perfecting to make this position unassailable. He shouted down in broken English that they were trapped, that they could not climb any further, that they should surrender and be treated according to the rules of war. Thapa said nothing. He raised his kukri again. Behind him, without a single word spoken, 59 other blades came out of their sheaths in one single motion. The sound it made, like dry leather and drawn steel, echoed once off the cliff face and then went silent. Kleinmeyer stood at the edge and did the arithmetic in his head. His machine guns faced outward and downward, oriented to repel an attack from below, not from behind. Reorienting them would take time he simply did not have against men who were already inside his perimeter. He knew exactly what the intelligence reports said about Gurkhas in close quarters combat. He knew what had happened to a German unit in Tunisia that tried to hold a position against a Gurkha night assault. He was not afraid of a fight. He was afraid of a fight that would end with his men dead in the corners of their own bunkers, killed by soldiers who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of darkness. At 7:12 that morning, and white flags appeared from Kleinmeyer's bunkers. 150 German soldiers, who had held this position for 23 days and repelled 3 organized assaults at a cost of 340 Allied casualties, walked out with their hands raised. The Gurkhas climbed the final 50 feet and accepted the surrender. Not one Gurkha had been wounded. Not a single shot had been fired in the final phase of the entire operation. Word spread through the German lines faster than any official report could travel. Within 72 hours, 17 other positions on the mountain surrendered the moment Gurkha units were seen forming up below them. Some sent white flags before anyone had even approached. One German officer commanding 60 men at the northern end of the mountain reportedly sent a written message that translated roughly to, "We have cliffs too. We are not fools." Within weeks, the German army had updated its tactical manuals. A new section addressed Gurkha infiltration methods and recommended, among other countermeasures, posting sentries on every vertical surface under 500 feet. Surfaces that had previously been dismissed as impossible to guard. The manual noted, in carefully measured language, that commanders facing Gurkha units should consider early surrender over close quarters engagement. since casualties in such fighting were simply unacceptable. American officers came to inspect the cliff 2 weeks after the surrender. They stood at the base, looked up, and reached the exact same conclusion the British had reached before the climb ever happened. Then a British sergeant who had been there that night told them plainly what he had watched 60 men do in complete darkness and silence, each carrying 60 pounds on his back. The Americans attempted the climb themselves in daylight, with ropes and rest stops along the way. 2 out of 3 made it to the ledge. All 3 agreed afterward that what the Gurkhas had done fell completely outside anything they believed trained soldiers were capable of. Within 6 months, the United States Army had begun designing what would eventually become the mountain phase of Ranger School. Built directly around the lesson that surprise achieved through vertical movement was worth more, tactically, than force achieved through frontal pressure, and the cliff itself was renamed on military maps. Everyone simply began calling it Gurkha's Ladder. Lalbahadur Thapa received the Victoria Cross, one of only 13 ever awarded to a Gurkha soldier. He returned home to Nepal in 1946, placed the medal in a drawer, and went back to farming. He raised goats, he grew barley. He never told war stories. When neighbors asked about the fighting, he simply said he had done his duty, and that others had done more. Kleinschmidt became a school teacher in Bavaria. He taught history and geography for 20 years. In 1965, a British veteran who had fought at Cassino passed through his town by chance, found his name in a telephone directory, and called him. They met for coffee. The veteran asked whether he regretted surrendering. Kleinschmidt said he had saved 150 lives that day, including his own. He said some of his fellow officers had called him a coward for it, but that none of those officers had ever stood at the edge of a cliff looking down at 60 drawn Gurkhas. He said something the veteran never forgot. Courage is knowing when to fight. Wisdom is knowing when fighting will only get your men killed for nothing. The ledge where 60 men spent 2 hours in total silence, waiting for the light, is still there. The limestone has not changed. Every year on the 13th of June, a small ceremony takes place at a plaque set into the rock below it, written in Italian, English, and Nepali. People come, stand at the base, look up, and most of them simply cannot fully grasp what it took to do what those 60 men did. The plaque says they achieved through courage and skill what force alone could never accomplish. But plaques are carved in stone, and stone cannot hold the full weight of a thing. What those 60 men actually achieved was both simpler and harder than courage. They looked at a wall that everyone around them had agreed could never be crossed. And they crossed it, not because they were stronger than the wall, but because they refused to accept that the wall was the only way through. That is not a military lesson. That is something much older than any army. And it is the reason this story still matters more than 80 years later.